My wife looked me in the eyes. "Don't call 911. I didn't do this." I begged as my daughter-in-law cried on the floor, accusing me of something I never did. But my wife believed her lie and watched the police take me away in handcuffs. Behind them, my own son stood there smiling like he had already won. For 36 months, I stayed silent in prison and rejected every message from them. But the day I walked free, I made one decision that would change everything. I am grateful you are here. On Revenge. Dad. Every story is told for a reason, and tonight, that reason is you. Tell me in the comments which city or country are you watching from. Let us know we are not alone in this. One note before we begin: some elements of this story are fictional, included for educational and entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to specific names or locations is purely coincidental, but what this story teaches you is worth every minute. My name is Walter Briggs. I am 65 years old, and the night my family destroyed me was a Friday in March. I was sitting in my study with a glass of water and a book I had been meaning to finish for 3 weeks. Rain hammered the windows of our Pasadena home, the kind of heavy, relentless California rain that turns the streets into shallow rivers and makes the whole world feel muffled and distant. I had spent 30 years as a federal prosecutor for the United States Attorney's Office in Los Angeles, 30 years of chasing liars, fraudsters, and criminals who believed they were untouchable. I had retired 3 years earlier, and I will admit that I had grown comfortable with the quiet, maybe too comfortable. Then I heard Sophia scream. The sound tore through the entire house like a blade, sharp, sudden, and full of a specific kind of pain that made every nerve in my body fire at once. I dropped my book and moved faster than a 65-year-old man had any right to move, throwing open the study door and rushing into the hallway. Sophia was lying at the bottom of the staircase. She was curled on her side, both hands clutching her ribs, her face twisted into an expression of raw agony. Her expensive silk blouse was twisted around her waist. Her dark hair fanned out across the hardwood floor. She let out another cry, sharp and broken, and her whole body shuddered with it. "Sophia!" I dropped to one knee beside her, my heart slamming against my sternum. "Sophia, can you hear me? Where does it hurt?" She flinched away from my hand before I could touch her shoulder. "Don't!" she gasped, her voice cracking. "Don't touch me!" I pulled my hand back immediately. I looked up and saw Nathan standing in the doorway of the living room, my son, 40 years old, broad-shouldered, dressed in the kind of casual clothing that costs more than most people's rent. He was not rushing toward his wife. He was not dropping to his knees beside her. He was standing with his arms loosely crossed over his chest, watching the scene in front of him with an expression I could not immediately name. "Nathan," my voice came out sharp, "call an ambulance, right now." He did not move. "Nathan, Mom already has the phone," he said. His voice was calm, completely unnaturally calm. I turned. Carol was standing at the far end of the hallway, her cell phone already pressed against her ear. My wife of 40 years. The woman whose hand I had held in the delivery room when Nathan came into the world. She was speaking quietly into the phone, her back half turned toward me, and she did not once look in my direction. "Carol," my voice cracked on her name. "Tell them she fell. Tell them it was an accident on the stairs." Carol's shoulders stiffened. She kept speaking into the phone. Outside, through the rain-streaked window beside the front door, I noticed a light on in the house across the street. My neighbor Linda Cho was standing in her front garden with a watering can, sheltering under the small overhang of her porch. She was looking directly at our house. Later, much later, I would understand exactly what she had seen from that angle. But in that moment, I had no idea how important Linda Cho was going to become. Sophia let out a long, shuddering moan against the floor. Her fingers tightened around her ribs. "She needs help," I said, turning back to Nathan. My voice was rising despite every effort I made to keep it level. "Why are you just standing there? She is your wife." Nathan finally moved, but not towards Sophia. He walked toward me slowly and stopped close enough that I could see the particular quality of stillness in his face. The kind of stillness that is not calm at all, but rather the surface of something running fast and cold underneath. "You should step back, Dad," he said quietly. "The police are coming." The word landed in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. "The police," I repeated. Sophia told Mom what happened. He held my gaze without blinking. "She said you pushed her." Every muscle in my body went rigid. The heat behind my eyes was immediate and overwhelming. Not tears, not yet, but the raw physical pressure of something enormous trying to find a way out. "That is not what happened," I said. My voice dropped to almost nothing. "Nathan, look at me. You know that is not what happened." He looked at me, and something moved across his face so fast I almost missed it. The corners of his mouth shifted, not into a full smile, just the suggestion of one, a small private expression of satisfaction that disappeared as quickly as it came. The sirens reached us 2 minutes later. Detective Ray Morrow was the one who came through my front door first. He was a broad man in his early 50s with the careful, watchful eyes of someone who had spent decades reading rooms before he walked into them. He took in the scene: Sophia on the floor, Carol against the wall, Nathan standing to one side, and then his eyes came to rest on me. "Sir," he said, "I'm going to need you to step outside with me." "I did not touch her," I said. My hands were trembling not from fear, from the sheer force of what I was trying to contain. "Detective, I was in my study. I heard her fall. I came out and she was already on the floor." Ray Morrow looked at me for a long moment. Then his gaze dropped briefly to Sophia, and I saw something flicker across his expression, quick and professional, there and gone as he registered the exact position of her body, the angle of her arm, the way she was cradling her left side. "Sir," he said again, and his tone was not unkind. "Please come with me." The handcuffs were cold. I had put handcuffs on hundreds of people over the course of my career. I had never fully understood until that moment how the metal feels against your wrists, not just physically, but in a way that reaches something deeper, something that has to do with dignity and the sudden terrible understanding of how quickly a life can be reframed by a single set of circumstances. As Ray Morrow guided me toward the patrol car, I turned back one final time. Carol was standing in the doorway, the phone now lowered to her side, her face unreadable in the yellow porch light. She was looking at me, and then she was not. She turned back into the house, and the door swung partially closed behind her. Nathan was still visible through the rain-blurred window. He had moved to Sophia's side now and had one hand on her shoulder, but his face was turned toward the patrol car, toward me. And in the fractured light coming through the wet glass, I watched the corner of his mouth curve upward one more time. That was the moment I understood. This was not an accident. This was not grief or anger or a terrible misunderstanding between family members. This was a plan, and it had just been executed exactly as intended. The car door closed, the rain came down, and somewhere behind me, in the house where I had lived for 22 years, my family was already moving on without me. The word I had written was names. I stared at it for a long moment, the single word sitting at the top of the yellow legal pad in my own handwriting, underlined twice with the kind of deliberate pressure that comes from a hand that is trembling but has not lost its grip. Ray Morrow sat across from me, watching, saying nothing. He had been a detective long enough to understand that what a person does in the first few minutes after a crisis is more revealing than anything they say. He was reading me the way I had spent 30 years reading other people. I did not mind. I was not hiding anything from Ray Morrow. I uncapped the pen and began to write beneath the word, not quickly, methodically, the way I had always built a case, starting with what I knew for certain and working outward from there. I wrote Nathan's name first, then Sophia's, then Gerald Fitch, the silver-haired attorney who had billed Nathan's network at rates that no ordinary family could have sustained, then Harold Penn in capital letters, with a question mark beside it that I would remove later when the question had an answer. Ray watched the pen move across the page. He did not ask what I was writing. He did not try to take the pad away. Something in the way I was sitting upright, focused, entirely calm, in a way that had nothing to do with innocence and everything to do with purpose, had shifted the quality of his attention. He was no longer conducting an interrogation. He was watching something he did not entirely understand. "Mr. Briggs," he said after several minutes had passed, "I have to ask you something." I looked up from the pad. "You waived your right to an attorney tonight." He leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on the edge of the table. "In my experience, people who do that fall into two categories: the ones who don't understand what they're giving up, and the ones who have a very specific reason for wanting to talk without anyone else in the room." He paused. "You're clearly not the first kind." "No," I said. "I'm not." "So, what's the reason?" I set the pen down on the pad. I looked at Ray Morrow across the table, at the careful, watchful eyes of a man who had spent decades in rooms exactly like this one, and who had learned somewhere along the way to pay attention to the things that did not add up. "Because I wanted you to hear this directly from me," I said. Not through a lawyer, not filtered through a legal strategy, directly. I folded my hands on the table. My daughter-in-law was not injured tonight because I pushed her. She was injured because she chose to be injured, and the only person in that house who knew that, besides her, was my son. Ray's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted a small, precise movement that told me he had already arrived at a version of the same conclusion and had been sitting with it since the moment he walked through my front door. "That's a serious allegation," he said. "It is," I agreed, "and I am not asking you to act on it tonight. I am not asking you to reopen anything or revisit any of the statements you have already taken. I am asking you to remember that you noticed something in that hallway." I held his gaze. "The injury location. You noticed it before you even spoke to me. I saw it on your face." Ray's jaw tightened, the same small controlled movement I had caught earlier. He picked up his pen and turned it once between his fingers without writing anything. "What I notice and what I can put in a report are two different things," he said. His voice had gone quiet in a way that was not evasion. It was honesty. The honesty of someone who understood exactly where the line was and knew he was standing on the wrong side of it. "I know," I said. "I spent 30 years understanding exactly how those two things can be separated by a single phone call from the right person to the right supervisor." I picked up my own pen again. "I'm not angry about it, Detective. I'm not here to create a problem for you. I'm here because I wanted you to know from the beginning that I am aware of what happened in that hallway, and I intend to be aware of everything that happens next." Ray looked at me for a long time. The fluorescent tube buzzed above us. Somewhere down the corridor, a door opened and closed, and then the building was quiet again. "You said you were starting a list," he said finally. "Yes." "What kind of list?" I looked down at the yellow pad, at the 4 names sitting beneath the word names. Each one written in my careful, practiced handwriting, each one representing a thread I intended to pull until the entire structure came apart. "The kind that takes time to complete," I said. "The kind where you have to be patient and methodical and willing to wait longer than the other side expects you to wait." I looked back up at him. "I have 36 months. That is more than enough time." Ray set his pen down and looked at me with an expression I recognized not from interrogation rooms, but from the faces of younger prosecutors in my office who had just encountered a case that did not fit the pattern they had been taught to expect. It was the expression of someone recalibrating. "I need to formally charge you and complete the booking process," he said. His voice had returned to its professional register, but the quality underneath it had changed. "Is there anything else you want to tell me before we do that?" I thought about Nathan standing in the doorway of the living room, with his arms loosely crossed, watching the scene with the particular stillness of a man who had rehearsed it. I thought about Carol turning her back before the first siren had even reached the street. I thought about the corner of Nathan's mouth curving upward through the rain-blurred glass as the patrol car pulled away. "One thing," I said. Ray waited. The night I put handcuffs on my first defendant, I said I was 28 years old. I remember thinking that the moment the cuffs closed, the case was essentially over, that the machinery of the system would take it from there, and the outcome was determined. I paused. I was wrong about that. I spent the next 30 years learning how many different points in a proceeding the outcome can change if the right person is paying attention at the right moment. I picked up the yellow pad and held it briefly before setting it back down. I am going to be paying attention. For as long as this takes. Ray Morrow stood. He gathered his folder, clicked his pen, and tucked it into his jacket pocket with the unhurried movements of a man whose shift had become something he had not anticipated when it began. At the door, he paused with his hand on the frame and turned back to look at me one final time. He did not say anything, but the way he looked at me, steady, direct, and carrying something in it that had not been there, when he first sat down, told me that Ray Morrow was going to think about this night for a long time. He turned and walked out. I looked back down at the yellow legal pad. 4 names beneath 1 word. The beginning of something that would take 36 months to finish, built one careful line at a time, in a room that smelled like burnt coffee and old paper, under a fluorescent light that buzzed and did not care about any of it. I picked up the pen. I kept writing. 3 weeks passed between the night of my arrest and the first day of trial. 3 weeks in which I slept on a narrow cot in a holding facility in Pasadena, ate food that tasted like cardboard soaked in salt water, and read every legal document my court-appointed attorney dropped on the table in front of me with the enthusiasm of a man who had already decided the outcome. His name was Douglas Hale. He was 34 years old, recently promoted from the public defender's pool, and he tried his best. I want to be fair about that. He tried his best with what he had. The problem was that what he had was almost nothing, because everything that had been submitted as evidence against me had been assembled with a precision that Douglas Hale had never seen before and could not fully account for. I had chosen Douglas deliberately, not because I could not access better representation, my federal pension and a separate retirement account, one that existed entirely outside the joint assets Carol and I had built together, one that Nathan had no knowledge of and no legal reach over, meant I had resources available to me. But I did not want Nathan to know that. I needed him to believe I was exactly what I appeared to be, a retired old man, with no money, no allies, and no plan. So, I sat beside Douglas Hale at the defendant's table in courtroom 14 of the Los Angeles Superior Court on the morning of March 28, 2022, and I looked like a man who had already given up. The courtroom smelled like wood polish and recycled air. The gallery was half full, mostly courthouse regulars, a few journalists who had picked up the story because of my former position. Nathan sat in the third row with his hands folded in his lap. He was wearing a charcoal suit and a dark tie, and he looked for all the world like a concerned and grieving son. My jaw tightened so hard my back teeth ached. Then the bailiff called the room to order, and Judge Harold Penn walked through the door behind the bench. I had not known Penn would be assigned to this case. When Douglas told me 2 days before the trial, I sat with that information for a long time before I responded. Because I knew Harold Penn. I had known him for 15 years. And the moment I heard his name, something cold and very precise began to crystallize in the back of my mind. In 2008, I had led an investigation into a series of real estate transactions in Orange County that smelled wrong from the moment I first reviewed the financial disclosures. The money trail eventually led to a sitting judge who had been quietly steering lucrative contract decisions toward a network of developers in exchange for payments routed through a series of intermediary accounts. That judge was Harold Penn. The case against Penn was strong, but Penn had an attorney who was stronger, a former colleague of mine, who knew exactly which procedural pressure points to press. The charges were ultimately dismissed on a technicality related to the chain of custody of certain financial documents. Penn walked. His reputation took damage, but he walked. And now he was sitting 12 feet above me in a black robe, arranging his papers with unhurried, deliberate movements. And the expression on his face was one of absolute professional composure. He did not look at me when he took his seat. That was the first sign. Sophia was brought in 20 minutes into the proceedings. She arrived in a wheelchair, gray dress hair, loose around her shoulders, both hands folded in her lap, over a folded tissue she occasionally raised to the corner of one eye. The jury watched her cross the room. I watched the jury watch her. 3 of the women in the front row had already shifted forward in their seats before Sophia spoke a single word. She was extraordinary. I will give her that. Whatever else Sophia was, she understood performance in a way that most people never learn. Every pause was exactly the right length. Every tremor in her voice arrived at precisely the moment it would land hardest. When the prosecuting attorney asked her to describe what happened on the staircase, she pressed her lips together, closed her eyes for 3 full seconds, and then spoke in a voice so quiet the room leaned in to hear her. "He grabbed my arm," she said. "I lost my balance. I tried to catch the railing, but I couldn't." She stopped, pressed the tissue to her eye. I just remember falling and the pain and then calling out for someone to help me. Nathan's attorney, a sharp silver-haired man named Gerald Fitch, who billed at rates that would have made Douglas Hale's eyes water, then called 3 additional witnesses. All 3 testified to witnessing tension between me and Sophia at various family gatherings over the preceding year. All 3 delivered their statements with the smooth, unhurried confidence of people who had rehearsed them many times. I wrote notes on the legal pad Douglas had given me, not about their testimony, about the pattern. Then I looked up at Harold Penn. He was watching Sophia with an expression of careful judicial neutrality. But twice in 40 minutes, he had sustained objections from the prosecution before Douglas had finished forming a rebuttal. Both times, the speed of Penn's response was fractionally faster than proper procedure allowed. Both times, Douglas had opened his mouth to continue and then stopped himself, sensing something in the room he could not quite identify. I could identify it. I had spent 15 years learning to read the architecture of a compromise proceeding. The way a biased referee controls a game is never obvious in any single call. It lives in the cumulative weight of small decisions, a sustained objection, here, a limited instruction, there, a ruling that arrives just quickly enough to cut off the momentum of the opposing argument before it can build. Penn was very good at it. He was significantly better than he had been in 2008. Douglas leaned toward me during a brief recess and whispered, "How are you holding up?" I looked at Harold Penn across the empty courtroom, arranging his notes with those same precise, unhurried movements. "I need you to request a transcript of every ruling Penn makes for the rest of this trial," I said quietly. "Every single one, time-stamped." Douglas frowned. "Walter, why?" "Because documentation is the only thing that survives a proceeding like this one," I said. "Please, Douglas, trust me on this." He looked at me for a long moment, his young face creased with uncertainty. Then he nodded and wrote it down. The afternoon session resumed, and as the prosecution continued building its carefully constructed case against me, I kept my eyes on Penn and my pen moving steadily across the legal pad. Tomorrow, Carol would take the stand. The thought hit me somewhere beneath the sternum, a dull spreading ache that had nothing to do with the courtroom or the law or the 15-year history sitting 12 feet above me in a black robe. It had to do with a woman I had loved for 4 decades, and what it was going to feel like to hear her voice confirm what her silence had already told me. They called her name at 9:17 in the morning. Carol Briggs. I had been staring at the grain of the wooden table in front of me, tracing the lines with my eyes the way a person does when they are trying to hold themselves together by focusing on something small and manageable. When I heard her name spoken aloud in that courtroom, my hands curled into fists beneath the table, and I made myself look up. Carol walked to the witness stand slowly. She was wearing a navy blue dress I had never seen before. She must have bought it recently, specifically for this. Her silver hair was pinned back neatly. She held herself very straight, the way she always did when she was frightened, and she kept her eyes fixed on the middle distance as she was sworn in. She did not look at me once. Gerald Fitch approached the stand with the unhurried confidence of a man who had already won. "Mrs. Briggs," he said warmly, "thank you for being here. I know this is an incredibly difficult situation for your family." Carol's throat moved as she swallowed. "Yes," she said, "it is. Can you describe the general atmosphere in the home between your husband and your daughter-in-law over the past year?" Carol's hands tightened in her lap. Her knuckles went pale against the dark fabric of her dress. When she spoke, her voice was low and carefully controlled the voice of someone reciting words they have gone over so many times, the feeling has been worn smooth. "There was tension," she said. "Walter could be very difficult. He had strong opinions about how Nathan and Sophia managed their lives, their finances, their decisions. Sophia tried very hard to maintain a good relationship with him, but he made it—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "He made it very hard." Something in my chest cracked open. Not broke. Cracked the way old wood splits along a fault line that has always been there waiting for the right kind of pressure. I breathed through it. I kept my face composed. I looked at my wife of 40 years, sitting 12 feet away from me, and I looked at her hands and I understood something I had not fully understood before. She was terrified. Not of me. Carol had never been frightened of me, but her hands were shaking, a fine, barely visible tremor running through her fingers. And twice during Fitch's questioning, she glanced toward the gallery quickly and voluntarily, the way a person looks toward the source of a threat they are trying not to acknowledge. I followed her gaze. Nathan was sitting in the third row. He was not looking at his mother. He was looking at his phone, turned face down on his knee, one thumb moving slowly across the darkened screen. Completely relaxed. The picture of a grieving son conserving his energy. The cold thing in the back of my mind sharpened into something almost painful. Nathan had something on Carol. That was the only explanation that fit the woman. I knew the woman who had once driven 4 hours in a thunderstorm to be at my mother's bedside, who had held my hand through the worst nights of my career, who had never once in 40 years done anything that required her to look away from the person she was speaking to. She was not betraying me because she wanted to. She was betraying me because she had been given no other choice. Douglas leaned close and whispered, "Do you want me to cross-examine?" "No," I said quietly. "Let her finish." Carol gave 3 more answers to Fitch's questions. Each one landed in my chest like something blunt and heavy. When Fitch finally thanked her and returned to his table, Carol stood from the witness stand, with the careful movements of someone whose legs are not entirely reliable beneath them. She made it 3 steps before her eyes finally found mine. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Her face did not change, but her chin dropped a fraction of an inch, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and then she looked away and walked back to her seat in the gallery, and I understood that she was not asking for my forgiveness. She was asking for something I did not yet know how to give her. Judge Penn's gavel came down at 4:43 that afternoon. 36 months, California State Prison, Chino. The number hit me like something physical, a blow to the sternum that sent the air rushing out of my lungs all at once. 36 months, 3 years. I stood and let them put the handcuffs on me for the second time, and this time I did not look at Nathan. I looked at Harold Penn. He was already gathering his papers. Efficient, composed, entirely satisfied with the day's work. He did not look back at me, but I looked at him for a long time. And as the officers guided me toward the side door, I felt the yellow legal pad in my memory, the single word I had written and underlined twice in that interrogation room 3 weeks ago. The word was names. I had a list to build, and 36 months to build it. California State Prison at Chino sits in the inland heat of San Bernardino County, about 35 miles east of Los Angeles. On the morning they brought me in, the air outside the transport van was dry and sharp, carrying the smell of dust and diesel, and something chemical I could not immediately identify. The San Gabriel Mountains were visible in the far distance, brown and low, against a pale sky. I looked at them through the narrow window of the transport van and thought about how different they looked from this angle, smaller somehow and very far away. The intake process took 4 hours. Photographs, fingerprints, medical evaluation, a property inventory that reduced 35 years of accumulated identity, down to the contents of a single plastic bag. I answered every question directly and without elaboration. When the intake officer recognized my name and looked up from his clipboard with an expression caught somewhere between surprise and professional discomfort, I held his gaze and waited until he looked back down at his paperwork. Word traveled faster than I expected. By the end of my first week, I had been reassigned from general population to a smaller unit that housed a mix of white-collar offenders and older inmates flagged for reduced risk classification. My cell had a window narrow barred but functional. I was granted access to the prison law library 3 afternoons a week. A senior corrections officer named Patterson, who had worked at Chino for 22 years, stopped by my cell on the 3rd evening, leaned against the doorframe, and said without preamble, "I know who you are, Mr. Briggs. Word came down from administration. You're not going to have any problems here." I thanked him. I meant it. But the thing that told me the most about my situation was not the reassignment or the library access. It was the mail. By the end of my 2nd week, I had received no letters, not one. I knew for certain that at least 3 of my former colleagues at the United States Attorney's Office would have written. Frank Delano alone would have written the day after my conviction. The absence of any correspondence was not a coincidence. It was a message, and it was not being sent by the prison administration. I began keeping track in the back of my legal pad. Dates, expected senders, the accumulating silence of a mailbox that should not have been empty. It was Marcus Webb who first put words to what I was already thinking. I met him in the law library on a Tuesday afternoon in my 3rd week. He was sitting at the far end of the long table, working through a stack of appeal documents with the careful, methodical focus of someone who has been at the same task for a very long time. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the kind of permanent exhaustion in his face that comes not from lack of sleep, but from carrying something heavy for too long. He looked up when I sat down, assessed me with a single unhurried glance, and said, "You're the prosecutor." "Former," I said. "Former," he agreed. He looked back at his documents. "Marcus Webb. I was a senior accounts manager at Pacific Regional Bank. I have been here for 14 months for a fraud scheme my direct supervisor designed, executed, and then attributed entirely to me when federal investigators showed up." He said it the way a person states a fact they have long since stopped being surprised by. "You don't look like someone who did what they said you did." My chest tightened at that, not with grief, but with something that felt almost like gratitude. It was the first time in weeks that anyone had said those words to me. "I didn't," I said. Marcus nodded slowly. "Didn't think so." He turned a page in his appeal stack. "The ones who actually did it come in here angry and loud. You came in quiet and started taking notes on your first day. That's not guilt, that's strategy." I looked at him for a moment. "How do you know I started taking notes on my first day?" He smiled a small, tired expression that reached his eyes just barely. "Because I did the same thing," he said, and Patterson mentioned it. We worked in the library for another 2 hours that afternoon, largely without speaking, but the quality of that shared space was different from the silence of the previous weeks. It was the silence of two people who understood each other's situation without requiring explanation. Before we left, Marcus closed his folder and said quietly, "There's a lawyer, works out of Pasadena, does a lot of pro bono appellate work, but that's not why people use him. He has a particular talent for maintaining communication channels that stay completely outside the standard monitored systems." He paused. "Attorney-client privilege in California is absolute. Every communication between an inmate and their legal counsel is 100% protected from institutional monitoring. Not reduced, not reviewed, completely protected." I understood immediately what he was telling me. "His name?" I asked. Marcus wrote it on the corner of a blank page, tore it off, and slid it across the table. I read it once, memorized it, and folded the paper into my palm. "Thank you," I said. Marcus picked up his folder and stood. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Thank me when it works." He walked out of the library. I sat at the table for another few minutes, turning the folded paper over and over in my hand, feeling the sharp edges of it against my fingers. 36 months suddenly felt like exactly enough time. The lawyer's name was Peter Wald. He drove out to Chino on a Wednesday morning in early June, signed in at the visitor processing desk as legal counsel, and was escorted to one of the attorney consultation rooms, a narrow space with a bolted table, 2 chairs, and a door that closed completely. No recording equipment, no monitoring feed. Under California law, every word spoken in that room between an attorney and his client was protected absolutely and permanently from institutional access. Peter Wald was 61 years old, with a quiet, unhurried manner and the kind of eyes that had seen enough of the legal system to find very little of it surprising. He set a yellow notepad on the table, clicked his pen, and looked at me. "Marcus tells me you need a channel," he said. "I need to reach someone," I said. "Reliably, regularly, and without any of it going through the standard mail system." Peter nodded. "Give me the name." "Frank Delano," I said. "He lives in Glendale. He worked under me at the United States Attorney's Office for 22 years. He retired 14 months before I did." I paused. "He is the most methodical investigator I have ever worked with, and he has been waiting for me to contact him since the night of my arrest. I am certain of that." Peter wrote the name down without any visible reaction. "I'll make contact within 48 hours, he said. "After that, anything Frank needs to communicate to you comes through me. Anything you need to communicate to him goes the same way." The financial arrangement followed immediately. The first transfer from my separate retirement account to Frank's operating fund went through Peter that same week. Nathan had no knowledge the account existed. He never would. 2 weeks later, Peter Wald returned to the consultation room. He set his notepad on the table, opened it to a page covered in neat handwriting, and turned it to face me. At the top of the page in Frank's unmistakable block lettering were 4 words. "I have been watching." My throat tightened so sharply I had to press the back of my hand against my mouth for a moment. 22 years of working alongside Frank Delano, and I knew exactly what those 4 words meant. They meant he had not waited to be asked. They meant he had started the moment he heard about my arrest. They meant I was not as alone as I had believed for the past 3 months. I steadied myself, breathed. Then I looked at Peter and said, "Tell me everything." Peter relayed Frank's report in precise, careful language. In the weeks following my conviction, Nathan had registered 3 new corporate entities through a registered agent in Delaware. Delaware incorporation was a common strategy for businesses seeking privacy. The state required minimal disclosure of ownership information, making it nearly impossible for outside parties to identify who actually controlled a given company without a court order. 3 new companies in 6 weeks with no apparent legitimate business purpose pointed in one direction. "Frank wants to know how deep you want him to go," Peter said. "All the way," I said without hesitating. "I want every company, every account, every transaction he can find. But he does not move on anything yet. He observes and he documents, nothing else." Peter made a note. "He also said to tell you something about your wife." My chest seized. "What about her?" Peter looked down at the notepad. "He said, and I'm quoting directly, Carol is not herself. Something is wrong. She is not returning calls from people she has known for years. She looks frightened every time I have seen her outside the house. Peter looked up. He wanted you to know. I sat with that for a long moment. The fluorescent light above us hummed steadily. My hands were flat on the table in front of me, and I focused on keeping them still, even as something hot and painful moved through my chest and settled behind my sternum like an ember. Carol was frightened. Carol, who had faced down aggressive defense attorneys in my cases without flinching, who had once told a particularly unpleasant neighbor exactly what she thought of him, in language that had made me genuinely proud. Carol was frightened and not returning phone calls, and Nathan had done something to bring that about. "Tell Frank to find out what Nathan has on her," I said. My voice came out lower and rougher than I intended. "That is the priority. Before the companies, before the accounts, I need to know what he is using to control her." Peter wrote it down. Then I leaned forward slightly and said, "And tell him one more thing. Tell him that whoever comes to visit me, claiming to represent any social services organization, any rehabilitation program, any community outreach group Nathan sent them. I need Frank to know that I will be performing for those visitors. Whatever they report back, it will be what Nathan needs to hear." Peter raised an eyebrow at that. "You're expecting surveillance." "I am expecting exactly what I would have done," I said. "Nathan learned from watching me for 40 years. He knows the value of information. He will want to know what condition I am in." I settled back in my chair. I intend to make sure he gets a very specific answer to that question. For the first time since I had sat down, the faintest suggestion of a smile appeared at the corner of Peter Wald's mouth. He clicked his pen twice and wrote something at the bottom of the page. Marcus was waiting outside the law library when I returned. He fell into step beside me without a word, and we walked the length of the corridor before he said quietly, "How did it go?" I thought about Frank's 4 words at the top of that notepad page. I thought about the 3 Delaware companies. I thought about Carol standing outside our house with frightened eyes and an unreturned phone. "It went," I said, "exactly the way it needed to." Marcus nodded. He asked nothing further, and we walked the rest of the way back in the kind of easy, companionable quiet that only exists between 2 people who understand that some information is safest when it stays exactly where it is. Frank's first full report arrived in late August, delivered through Peter Wald in a manila envelope so thick it bent slightly at the corners from the weight of its contents. I read it in the law library over the course of 2 afternoons, with Marcus sitting across from me, working through his own appeal paperwork, occasionally glancing up when he heard me turn a page with more force than necessary. By the time I reached the final page, my jaw ached from the sustained pressure of keeping my expression neutral. The numbers in front of me were not the numbers of a man making bad business decisions. They were the numbers of a man who had been building something deliberate and systemic for a very long time. 17 companies, all incorporated in Delaware through a registered agent with offices in Wilmington, each one with a name that suggested something bland and legitimate: Crestview Consulting, Pacific Meridian Holdings, Cornerstone Advisory Group, the kind of names that were designed to be forgotten the moment they were read. Frank had traced the actual cash flows beneath those names. The money moved in a specific pattern collected through a network of online payment processors that routed funds through multiple accounts before consolidating them in the Delaware entities. The underlying business was sports betting, not the legal regulated variety that California was still debating how to license. The other kind. The kind that operated through private servers, encrypted communication channels, and a client roster that stretched from Los Angeles east to New York, generating revenues that Frank estimated at somewhere above $30 million annually, a figure that placed it squarely within the jurisdiction of 18 United States Code. Section 1955, the federal statute that makes operating or financing an illegal gambling business a serious felony carrying up to 5 years per count. Sophia's role was different but equally deliberate. She had been creating invoices, hundreds of them, over a period of 18 months, billing the Delaware companies for services that had never been rendered: graphic design, marketing consultation, event coordination. Each invoice was modest enough to avoid triggering automatic review thresholds, but collectively they had moved nearly $4 million of illegal gambling revenue into the family real estate business as apparent legitimate income. That was 18 United States Code Section 1343 wire fraud applied to a money laundering operation of considerable sophistication. And Carol had signed the real estate company's annual filings. Twice. I set that page down and pressed both hands flat against the table. Marcus looked up. Bad, he asked. Comprehensive, I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Nathan has been building this for years. This did not start because he needed money. This started because he wanted a structure that could not be easily dismantled. I picked the page back up. He used the family business as the foundation because it already had legitimate history. He put Carol's name on it because it added another layer of apparent credibility. I paused. And because it gave him another way to control her. Marcus set his pen down. How so? If this unravels, I said, Carol's signatures are on the filings. Without the right legal protection, she could be exposed to conspiracy charges simply for signing documents she did not understand. Nathan knows that. He made sure she signed before she had any reason to question what she was signing. I looked at the ceiling for a moment, breathing carefully through the tightness in my chest. He built a cage around her using her own hand. 3 days after I finished reading Frank's report, the visitor came. He arrived on a Thursday morning, signed in as a representative of a non-profit organization called the California Reintegration Partnership, and presented credentials that looked entirely legitimate. He was a pleasant man in his early 40s with a practiced sympathetic expression and a tablet computer on which he took careful notes. His name, he said, was Douglas Farrell. Mr. Briggs, he said, settling into the chair across the consultation table with the easy manner of someone accustomed to these conversations. I just want to check in on how you're adjusting. This transition can be very difficult, especially for individuals who have spent their careers in professional environments. I looked at him for a long moment. I took in the tablet, the practiced empathy, the slight tightness around his eyes that suggested he was paying more attention than his relaxed posture implied. Then I let my shoulders drop. It was a small movement barely perceptible, but in the language of body posture, it communicated everything Nathan would have instructed this man to look for. I let my hands loosen in my lap. I let the sharpness go out of my gaze and replaced it with something flatter and more distant. I spoke slowly with the careful cadence of a man choosing words because the right ones no longer came easily. It has been hard, I said. Harder than I expected. I paused, looking down at the table. I spent 30 years believing in the system, believing that if you did the right things, the right outcomes followed. Another pause. I think I was wrong about that. Douglas Farrell typed something on his tablet, his shoulders relaxed by a fraction. Have you had any contact with family? He asked. No, I said. I don't expect any. He typed again. He asked 3 more questions, each one angled toward assessing whether I had resources, allies, or any active legal strategy in motion. I answered each one with the quiet, deflated honesty of a man who had stopped fighting. When he left 40 minutes later, I sat at the table until I heard the outer door of the consultation area close behind him. Then I straightened in my chair, picked up the pen Peter Wald had left me, and wrote 4 words at the top of a fresh page. He believed every word. Marcus was waiting outside. When I came through the door, he looked at my face and said, "Well, Nathan just confirmed he is nervous." I said, keeping my voice low as we moved down the corridor. Nervous men make decisions based on incomplete information. He thinks I am finished. I tucked the notepad under my arm. That is the most useful thing he has given me since this started. Marcus exhaled through his nose, a short, quiet sound that was as close to a laugh as I had ever heard from him. Frank's next report, I said. I need him to go deeper on the financial flows, and I need the name of every account that touches those Delaware companies. I glanced at Marcus. It's time to start building the second list. Frank's answer came on a Tuesday morning in October, 7 months into my sentence. Peter Wald set the envelope on the table between us without his usual preliminary remarks. He just placed it there and folded his hands on top of his notepad and waited. That told me something before I even opened it. In 6 months of working together, Peter had never once modified his routine. The fact that he did it now meant that whatever Frank had found, Peter had already read it, and he had decided that the delivery required a different kind of attention. I opened the envelope. The report was 4 pages. I read all 4 without stopping. When I finished, I set the papers face down on the table and pressed both palms flat against the back of the last page, as if I could somehow contain what was written there by covering it with my hands. Take whatever time you need, Peter said quietly. I did not need time. I needed to think clearly, and thinking clearly meant setting aside the part of me that was a husband and using only the part of me that had spent 30 years understanding how people use information as a weapon. What Frank had found was this. 2 years before my arrest, Nathan had hired a private investigator, a former law enforcement officer operating out of Burbank, to conduct extended surveillance on Carol. The surveillance had run for 4 months. During that time, the investigator had documented a series of written communications between Carol and a man named Robert Ashby, a retired architect who lived in Santa Barbara. Carol and Robert Ashby had known each other for 38 years. Their relationship had predated her marriage to me by 2 years. The correspondence Frank recovered was careful and warm, and almost entirely innocent. 2 people in their 60s maintaining a friendship across a long distance. But there were 3 letters written over a span of 18 months in which the language shifted slightly. Not dramatically, not into anything that could be called explicit, but enough. Enough that a person reading them with a particular intention could construct a particular narrative. Nathan had those letters. He had shown them to Carol 8 months before my arrest. And he had told her with the patient specificity of someone who has rehearsed a conversation many times exactly what he would do with them if she did not cooperate with what he was planning. I sat with that for a very long time. The fluorescent light above the consultation table hummed its usual steady note. My hands were still pressed against the papers. I became aware gradually that my jaw was aching again, the same deep grinding ache I had first noticed in the courtroom, the one that came from keeping my face composed when what was happening beneath it was anything but. Carol had not betrayed me because she stopped loving me. She had betrayed me because she was trying to protect something, a small private piece of her history that she had carried quietly for 38 years, that had never once threatened our marriage, that had never been anything more than letters between 2 people who had known each other in a different life. Nathan had taken that quiet private thing and turned it into a loaded weapon. He had pressed it against her and told her to perform. And she had performed, because she was 61 years old and she was terrified, and she did not know in that moment that there was any other choice. "Tell Frank to document everything about the private investigator," I said. My voice was rough in a way I did not try to smooth out. "I want the name of the firm, the dates of the surveillance, the methods used, and every piece of documentation the investigator produced. All of it." Peter wrote without looking up. "Anything else?" "Yes." I picked the papers up and aligned the edges carefully, the way I always did when I needed something to do with my hands. "Tell Frank that Carol is not a target. She is a witness. Whatever happens at the end of this, she cooperates with federal investigators and she gets full immunity. That is not a negotiating position. That is the outcome." Peter looked up at that. "That's a significant concession." "It is not a concession," I said. "It is the truth. She was coerced. The legal standard for duress in a federal conspiracy context is well established, and what Nathan did to her meets every element of it." I set the papers back down. "She will not be prosecuted. I will make certain of it." Peter nodded slowly and wrote it down. When I returned to the general corridor, Marcus was sitting on a bench outside the library with his arms resting on his knees and his head slightly bowed, the posture of a man who had learned to rest in small increments wherever he could find them. He looked up when he heard my footsteps and took one look at my face. "Bad news?" he asked. I stopped walking. I stood for a moment in the middle of the corridor, feeling the full weight of the 7 months that had passed since the night on the staircase, feeling the specific shape of what Nathan had done, not just to me, but to his own mother, to the woman who had raised him and trusted him and signed her name on his documents because he had told her it was fine. "My son," I said, and my voice cracked straight down the middle on the second word, used his mother's oldest friendship as a tool. I stopped, pressed my hand briefly against my sternum, where the ache was sharpest. She was not a collaborator, she was a hostage, and he put her in that position deliberately because he knew it was the one thing I could not immediately fix from inside a prison cell. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "But you can fix it eventually." I lowered my hand from my chest. I straightened my back. "Yes," I said, "I can." I walked the rest of the way back to my cell with my hands steady at my sides and the particular cold clarity that had been building in me since March settling deeper into my bones. Nathan had made one fundamental miscalculation. He had assumed that the things he used to hurt the people I loved would weaken me. He had never understood that they would only make the list longer. Before I tell you what Frank found on that server in San Jose, the one piece of evidence that changed everything I need to know if you are still with me, Drop the number 9 in the comments right now. Just the number. That is all I need to know you are here. And a quick note before we continue the story ahead, contains some fictional elements shaped for reflection and education. If that is not what you came for tonight, no hard feelings, you are free to step away at any time. Frank had been pulling at the same thread for 11 weeks before it finally gave way. Peter Wald arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late November with a manila envelope thinner than usual, but held with both hands, which was not his habit. He set it on the table between us and said before I could reach for it, "This one is different from the others." I looked at him. "The others were about what Nathan built," Peter said. "This one is about the night it started." I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a technical summary written in Frank's characteristic block lettering, dense with detail and entirely without flourish. I read it twice slowly, and by the time I reached the final paragraph, my hands were no longer steady against the page. Here is what Frank had found. The security camera system installed in my Pasadena home 3 years earlier used a mid-range consumer device manufactured by a company headquartered in San Jose. Like most modern home security systems, the device operated on a dual storage protocol. Footage was saved locally to a hard drive unit inside the house, but it was also automatically and continuously backed up to the manufacturer's cloud server infrastructure in real time. The local hard drive could be accessed and wiped by anyone with the administrative login credentials. The cloud server backup could not. Under the company's data retention policy, uploaded footage remained on the server for a minimum of 60 days, regardless of what happened to the local copy. Nathan had deleted the local footage from the night of March 14th. He had replaced it with an edited version, a file showing a fragment of the staircase landing, carefully clipped, to exclude the 12 minutes before my study door opened. What he had not deleted because he had not known it existed was the original file sitting untouched on a server farm in San Jose. Frank had filed a court order under 18 United States Code, Section 2703, the federal statute governing law enforcement access to stored electronic communications and data held by third-party providers. The statute allowed a court to compel a technology company to produce stored data when presented with evidence of a crime and a signed judicial order. Frank had presented both. The manufacturer had complied within 72 hours. The original footage showed the following. At 6:47 in the evening, on March 14th, Sophia Briggs entered the front door of my home alone. The timestamp was clear and unambiguous. She walked through the entrance hall and moved toward the staircase. At 6:49, she reached the top step. At 6:51, she descended 4 steps and stopped. She stood motionless for approximately 8 seconds. Then she took one more step, shifted her weight to her left foot, and went down. At 703, my study door opened and I stepped into the hallway. 12 minutes. 12 minutes between the moment Sophia entered my house alone and the moment I emerged from my study. 12 minutes during which I had been sitting in a chair 30 feet away, reading a book completely unaware of anything that was happening on the other side of a closed door. I set the paper down. My throat had closed completely. I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth and sat very still, breathing through my nose in the long, controlled pattern I had learned to use when the feeling inside my chest became too large for the space available to it. The fluorescent light hummed. Somewhere in the corridor outside the consultation room, a door opened and closed. "Walter." Peter's voice was careful and quiet. "Take your time." I lowered my hand from my mouth. My eyes were burning in a way I had not experienced since the first week at Chino, when I had lain awake on the narrow cot in my cell and listened to the sounds of the unit settling around me and understood for the first time at a cellular level that I was genuinely alone. "She planned it before she walked through the door," I said. My voice came out rough and stripped of its usual precision. "She stood on that staircase and she made a choice. In my house, on my stairs. She made a deliberate choice and then she screamed my name." Peter did not respond immediately. He let the words exist in the room without rushing to manage them. "What do we do with it?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. I needed to say it aloud. "Frank files a motion under Section 2703 to formally preserve the data," Peter said. "The manufacturer retains the original file under legal hold. It cannot be altered or destroyed from this point forward. Frank also requests a certified forensic copy, which becomes part of the evidentiary record." He paused. This footage, combined with Ray Morrow's observations about the inconsistency in Sophia's injury location, creates a significant foundation for the motion to vacate your conviction. "Not yet," I said immediately. Peter looked at me. "We do not move on the conviction yet," I said. "If we file now, Nathan sees it coming. He destroys what he can, moves the money he hasn't moved yet, and disappears before we have everything." I picked the paper back up and aligned it carefully with the edge of the table. We preserve the footage. We document everything Frank is building, and we wait until the case is so complete that when we move, there is nowhere left for any of them to go. Peter wrote it down without argument. He had learned over the preceding months that my strategic instincts were worth following, even when the immediate impulse was toward faster action. "There is one more thing," he said before I could stand. Frank mentioned a name, a former employee of Nathan's, an accounts manager who has been trying to reach you since month 2 of your sentence. Peter checked his notes. "His name is Greg Paulson. Frank believes Nathan's people intercepted his correspondence before it reached you." The name landed with the specific weight of a piece that had been missing, without my knowing it was missing. "Find him," I said, "before Nathan does." Frank found Greg Paulson on a Wednesday morning in January, parked outside a grocery store in Monrovia in a 12-year-old Civic with the engine running and both hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup that had long since gone cold. Frank had been watching the car for 20 minutes before he knocked on the passenger window. Peter Wald relayed all of this to me the following week, with the careful, unhurried detail of a man who understood that I needed to see it clearly. Not just the information, but the shape of the man who was carrying it. Greg Paulson was 44 years old. He had spent 11 years as a senior accounts manager, first at a mid-sized logistics firm in Burbank, then for the last 4 years, inside the financial infrastructure of Nathan's network of Delaware companies. He had not known when he took the job what he was walking into. By the time he understood the full scope of what Nathan was operating, he had already signed enough internal documents to make his position legally precarious, and Nathan had made certain he understood that. When Frank knocked on the car window, Greg had flinched so hard he spilled the cold coffee across his lap. Frank opened the passenger door, sat down, and said simply, "I work for Walter Briggs. He knows Nathan intercepted your letters. He sent me to find you before Nathan decided you were a liability he could no longer afford." Greg had stared at Frank for a long moment. Then his eyes had filled with tears, not the slow, dignified kind, but the sudden, uncontrolled kind that comes from a body that has been holding too much pressure for too long without any release. His shoulders shook. His breath came out in a series of ragged, broken intervals that had nothing composed about them. "I have been waiting," Greg said, his voice cracking apart on the last word, "for 10 months. I sent 3 letters. I did not know if any of them got through. I did not know if he even knew I was trying." "He knew," Frank said. "He's been waiting for me to find you." Peter paused in his relay of the account and looked at me across the consultation table. My chest was tight. I pressed one hand flat against the table and nodded for him to continue. Greg Paulson, it turned out, had been keeping records from his very first month inside Nathan's operation. Not because he had anticipated needing them as legal protection, at least not initially. He had kept them because he was at his core an accountant. The habit of documentation was as natural to him as breathing. When the nature of what he was documenting began to reveal itself, he had made a decision he would continue keeping the real records alongside the falsified ones Nathan's structure required, and he would store both sets in a fireproof safe in the utility room of his home in Monrovia. The safe contained 14 months of parallel ledgers. One set showed the numbers Nathan's operation officially reported, the laundered figures, the inflated invoices, the sanitized summaries that made $30 million of illegal gambling revenue look like the unremarkable earnings of a mid-sized consulting group. The second set showed everything else, the actual inflows from the betting network, the real account numbers, the names of the payment processors, the routing details for the consolidation transfers, the dates and amounts of every distribution made from the Delaware companies to personal accounts held by Nathan and Sophia. And on page 47 of the second ledger, in a column labeled simply External Consultants, Greg had recorded a series of quarterly payments routed through a holding account in Nevada to a personal account registered in the name of a trust. The trust was called the Penn Family Administrative Trust. The payments had begun 6 months before my arrest. They had continued at regular intervals through the month of my conviction. Harold Penn had been on Nathan's payroll for over a year before he ever sat down in that courtroom. When Peter read me that section of Frank's report, I stood up from my chair. I did not do it deliberately. My body simply rose, driven by something that moved through me too fast and too forcefully to be contained in a seated position. I walked to the wall, pressed both palms flat against the painted concrete, and stood there with my forehead nearly touching the surface, breathing in the slow, measured pattern that was the only thing I knew how to do when the magnitude of something exceeded what I could process while remaining still. "Walter," Peter's voice was quiet and steady behind me. "Give me a moment," I said. I gave myself 60 seconds. Then I pushed back from the wall, returned to my chair, and sat down. "Greg needs a cooperation agreement," I said. My voice had returned to its working register, lower than usual, but functional. Full immunity from prosecution in exchange for his testimony, his records, and his complete cooperation with federal investigators. He approaches the United States Attorney's Office directly represented by independent counsel, not Peter, someone with no visible connection to me. Peter wrote it down. "And the ledgers?" "Frank secures certified copies of both sets immediately," I said. "The originals stay in Greg's safe until we are ready to move. If anything happens to Greg before then—" I stopped. The sentence had an ending I did not want to say aloud, so I redirected it. "Make sure Frank checks on him, regularly, in person." Peter nodded. "Penn took money from my son for 14 months, I said. The words felt strange in my mouth, too large and too specific to be spoken in a normal conversational register. He sat in that courtroom, and he sentenced me to 36 months, knowing exactly what he was doing and exactly who was paying for the outcome. I looked at Peter steadily. When this is over, he does not just lose his position. He goes to trial under California Penal Code, Section 92 bribery of a judicial officer, and every ruling he made in that courtroom gets reviewed for misconduct. Peter set his pen down and looked at me directly for a long moment. "You understand," he said carefully, "that what Greg has just given you is potentially sufficient to vacate your conviction on its own." "I know," I said, "and you still want to wait." "I still want to wait," I said, "because right now Nathan believes he has won, and a man who believes he has won stops watching his perimeter." I picked up the papers in front of me and straightened them against the edge of the table. I need him to keep not watching for a little while longer. Peter retrieved his pen. He wrote something at the bottom of his notes, then looked up. "Frank says there are 2 more people you need, a detective and a neighbor." I recognized both immediately from the list I had been building since March. "Tell Frank," I said, "that it's time." 8 months passed between Greg Paulson's cooperation agreement and the afternoon Frank drove to Ray Morrow's house in Altadena. Peter Wald summarized those 8 months in a single paragraph. During one of our October sessions, financial documentation continued to accumulate. Greg had met twice with a federal investigator from the United States Attorney's Office under the terms of his agreement, and Nathan's network had continued operating with the particular confidence of an enterprise that believes itself to be completely invisible. Frank had been watching the money move and had been cataloging every transaction with the methodical patience of a man who had spent 2 decades learning that the most important evidence was almost always the evidence that accumulated slowly. But Ray Morrow was different from Greg Paulson. Greg had been waiting to be found. Ray Morrow, by all appearances, had not been waiting for anything, or so it seemed, until Frank knocked on his front door on a Tuesday afternoon in September, and Ray opened it before Frank's hand had finished moving. Peter relayed the account the following week. Ray Morrow lived in a small craftsman house on a quiet street in Altadena, 8 miles northeast of Pasadena. He had been with the LAPD for 26 years. He was 50 years old, broad and weathered, in the way that comes from spending decades in situations that require a specific kind of durability. And when he opened the door and saw Frank standing on his porch, he did not ask how Frank had found him or what he wanted. He said, "I've been expecting someone." Frank told me later through Peter that those 4 words hit him with the same force that Frank's 4 words I have been watching had hit me 18 months earlier in that consultation room. They were the words of a man who had been carrying something for a long time and had arrived at the point where the carrying was becoming more difficult than the alternative. Ray invited Frank inside. The living room was neat and spare with the functional tidiness of someone who lived alone and had no strong feelings about decoration. On the coffee table, already out and waiting, as though Ray had placed it there in anticipation of exactly this visit, was a manila folder with a rubber band around it. Ray sat down across from Frank, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and said, "The night I brought Walter Briggs in, something was wrong. I knew it before I left the house." His voice was flat and direct, stripped of any performance. The injury pattern did not match the fall description. "I have been doing this work for over 2 decades. A person who falls forward down a staircase and lands on their left side does not present with primary impact bruising on their right hip and lower back. The physics do not work." Frank asked him why he had not raised it at the time. Ray's jaw tightened. He looked down at the folder on the coffee table, then back up at Frank. "I raised it with my supervisor the morning after the arrest," he said. 40 minutes later, I was told clearly and without ambiguity that the case was straightforward and my observations were not required." He paused. The pause had a specific texture to it, the texture of a man choosing his next words with the care of someone who has rehearsed them many eames and still finds them difficult. "My supervisor has had a professional relationship with Harold Penn for 11 years. I did not know that when I raised my concerns. I found out 3 weeks later." He picked up the folder, pulled the rubber band off, and set it open on the coffee table between them. Inside were 23 pages of handwritten notes, organized chronologically and indexed in a margin notation system that Frank recognized immediately as standard investigative documentation. Behind the notes were 11 photographs, crime scene images Ray had taken on his personal phone the night of March 14th, before the official photography team arrived. The images showed the staircase from 4 angles, Sophia's position on the floor, and 2 close-up shots of the impact marks on the hardwood that Ray had noticed did not align with her stated account of how she had fallen. There was also a single typed page at the back of the folder. Ray had written it himself on his personal computer the week after the trial. It was a summary of the physical inconsistencies he had observed written in the precise declarative language of an official report, even though he had never been permitted to file one. "I have been sitting on this for 18 months, Ray said. His voice dropped lower, and something in it shifted. The flatness gave way to something that had more weight to it, more friction. "I have not slept well in 18 months. I want that on the record wherever the record eventually goes." He looked at Frank directly. "Walter Briggs did not do what he was convicted of. I knew that on the night I put the handcuffs on him, and I have known it every day since, and I am done knowing it quietly." Frank asked him what he wanted in return. Ray shook his head, and the gesture was short and emphatic. "Nothing," he said. "I don't want immunity because I haven't done anything that requires it. I don't want money because this isn't about money." He reached forward and closed the folder. "I want to testify, officially on the record in front of whatever court or investigative body ends up handling this. I want to say what I saw and what the physical evidence showed and what my supervisor told me to do with it." His voice had gone rough at the edges in a way he did not try to smooth over. "That's all I want. The chance to say it out loud where it counts." When Peter finished relaying this, I sat for a moment with my hands flat on the table in front of me, feeling the particular quality of what Ray Morrow had just given me. Not just the photographs and the notes and the typed summary, but the thing underneath all of it. The 26-year cop who had spent 18 months not sleeping because he had put handcuffs on a man he knew was innocent and had been told to keep that knowledge to himself. "He gets everything he asked for," I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended, and I did not correct it. "His testimony goes on the record. His name goes into the formal evidence package. When this is over, what he did here gets documented." I stopped, pressed my hand briefly against my sternum. "He carried that for a year and a half. The least I can do is make sure it means something." Peter wrote it down. "There is one more," I said. "Linda Cho." Peter confirmed, "Yes." I looked at the wall across from me, the same painted concrete I had pressed my palms against the week before, when the news about Penn had moved through me faster than I could contain it. "Tell Frank to be gentle with her. She is not Greg, and she is not Ray. She is a 65-year-old woman who got a phone call in the dark and made the only decision that felt safe." I paused. "She deserves to be approached like a person, not like a piece of evidence." Peter looked up from his notepad. He held my gaze for a moment, and in the slight adjustment of his expression, I understood that something I had just said had landed differently from the way my words usually landed in that room. He nodded and wrote it down. Frank did not knock on Linda Cho's door the way he had knocked on Ray Morrow's. He stood on the front porch of her small house on Marengo Avenue in Pasadena for a full minute before he raised his hand. He had told Peter afterward that he spent that minute looking at the potted plants arranged along the porch railing, 12 of them in various sizes, all thriving and carefully tended, and thinking about what Walter had said. Approached like a person, not like a piece of evidence. Then he knocked. Peter relayed the account to me on a Thursday afternoon in November, 2 years and 8 months into my sentence, sitting across from me in the consultation room, with his notepad open and his voice carrying the particular quality it had developed over the preceding months, the quality of a man who had learned that some information needed to be delivered slowly. Linda Cho was 65 years old. She had lived on Marengo Avenue for 19 years, 3 houses down from the home. Carol and I had shared for 22. She had brought us a lemon cake when we first moved in. She had attended Nathan's graduation party in the backyard 17 years ago. She had waved to me across the street on the morning of my retirement 3 years before my arrest and called out that it was about time I slowed down. When she opened the door and saw Frank standing on her porch, she recognized him. Frank had been careful to approach only after sending a short, handwritten note 2 days earlier, not explaining the full situation, only saying that he worked for Walter Briggs, and that he would very much like to speak with her at her convenience, and that she was under no obligation of any kind. The note had been written by hand on plain paper, with no letterhead or official-looking markings of any kind. Frank had understood from everything Walter had told him that Linda Cho had been frightened by official-looking things for 20 months. She opened the door wider and said, "Come in, I made coffee." The living room was warm and densely furnished in the way of someone who had spent decades accumulating things that mattered: photographs on every surface, shelves crowded with books and small ceramic figures, a large orange cat asleep across the arm of the sofa, who did not stir when Frank sat down in the chair across from it. Linda set 2 mugs on the coffee table and lowered herself into the sofa beside the cat. She folded her hands in her lap. Her knuckles were white and her jaw was set with the particular tightness of a person who has rehearsed being composed and is working very hard to execute it. "I know why you're here," she said. Her voice was steady but thin at the edges, the way a voice gets when the steadiness is costing something. "I have known for 20 months that someone would eventually come." Frank told her he was sorry it had taken this long. Linda's eyes filled immediately, not spilling over, just filling the way a person's eyes do when the thing they have been holding finally meets something that acknowledges its weight. She pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose for a moment before she spoke again. "I saw her," Linda said, "that evening. I was watering my plants on the front porch. I do it every Friday evening, same time it's a habit, and I saw Sophia walk up your driveway." Her voice tightened further. She was alone. Walter was not outside. There was no one with her. She went up the front steps and she let herself in with a key, and I thought nothing of it because she was family and she had been there many times before. She stopped. 15 minutes later, I heard the sirens. Frank asked her about the phone call she had received. Linda's hands pressed harder together in her lap. The orange cat lifted its head briefly, then settled again. "The night after the arrest," she said. "A man called. I don't know who he was. He didn't say his name. He said he knew I had been outside that evening, and that if I told anyone what I thought I saw, it would be very bad for me." Her chin was trembling now slightly, the kind of trembling that happens at the edge of a composure that is being held by sheer force of will. "He knew my daughter's name. He knew where she worked. He said it very casually, the way you mention something you already know has been understood." Frank set his pen down on his knee. "I was so frightened," Linda said, and her voice broke on the last word. Not dramatically, not in a way that asked for anything, but in the small, honest way of someone who has been ashamed of their fear for a long time and is finally allowing themselves to name it. "I told myself I was protecting my daughter, but Walter was in prison, and I knew what I had seen, and every single day I knew, and I—" She stopped. Her shoulders dropped. The composure she had been holding so carefully came apart quietly without drama, tears sliding down her face in the unhurried way of someone who has been crying internally for 20 months and is only now allowing it to reach the surface. Frank waited. He did not fill the silence with reassurances or redirect her toward the next question. He just waited the way Walter had taught him to wait, with complete stillness and without impatience, until she was ready. After a long moment, Linda reached up and pressed both palms against her cheeks, pushing the tears back with a gesture that was more businesslike than distressed. She inhaled. She sat up straight. "I have something," she said. She stood and walked down the hallway. Frank heard a drawer open then close. Then another drawer. Then she came back into the living room holding a phone, an older model, the kind with a cracked screen in the lower left corner that someone had covered with a small piece of clear tape to keep the glass in place. She held it out to Frank with both hands. "I was filming the plants," she said. "I do that sometimes. I send the videos to my daughter because she likes them. I didn't even realize I had caught anything until the next morning when I watched it back." Her voice had steadied again, the way a voice steadies once the decision has been made and the object of the decision is already in someone else's hands. "It's 11 seconds. The angle is from the porch. You can see the driveway and the front steps clearly." Frank took the phone. He found the video. He pressed play. 11 seconds. The frame was slightly unsteady in the way of a handheld recording, and the audio carried the soft ambient sound of a Pasadena. Friday evening distant traffic, a dog somewhere 2 streets over, the light percussion of water against leaves. And in the right half of the frame, walking up the driveway with a purposeful, unhurried stride, entirely and unmistakably alone, was Sophia Briggs. Frank watched it twice. Then he looked up at Linda. "May I have this phone?" he said, "or can you send me the file directly?" "Take the phone," Linda said. "I bought a new one 3 weeks ago. I kept the old one because of this." She looked at it in Frank's hand for a moment. "I kept it because I couldn't throw away the only thing I had that told the truth." When Peter finished the account, I sat without speaking for a long time. Not because I had nothing to say, but because what I was feeling was something I had not expected. Not relief, not satisfaction, not the cold, clarifying anger that had carried me through most of the preceding 20 months. What I felt was something quieter and more complicated than any of those. It was the feeling that comes from understanding that the truth had never stopped existing. It had only been waiting in an old phone with a cracked screen in a drawer on Marengo Avenue, tended as carefully as 12 potted plants on a porch by a woman who had been frightened for 20 months and had kept it safe anyway. "Tell Frank to get her a security detail," I said. "Discreet but real, until this is over." I stopped. "And tell him to send her flowers, from me. Nothing that needs to be explained, she'll understand." Marcus was waiting outside the consultation room when I came through the door. He looked at my face and said nothing. For a moment, just walked beside me down the corridor, matching my pace. After a while, he said, "Good news." I thought about Linda Cho's hands shaking as she held out that phone. I thought about 11 seconds of footage in a drawer for 20 months. "The last piece," I said. Marcus nodded slowly. "So, what happens now?" I thought about Nathan. About the Delaware companies still moving money, about Penn in his courtroom, about the second passport I did not yet know about but would in 15 months. "Now," I said, "we wait for the right moment." 15 months passed, the way the preceding months had passed in the accumulated weight of documentation in Frank's regular reports delivered through Peter Wald, in the slow and methodical construction of something that was becoming, page by page and account by account, impossible to dismantle. Nathan's network had continued to expand. The Delaware companies had multiplied from 17 to 23. The illegal betting operation had pushed further east, adding client infrastructure in Philadelphia and Boston. Greg Paulson had met 4 more times with the federal investigator, assigned to his cooperation agreement each session, adding another layer of granular financial detail to a record that was growing into one of the most comprehensively documented cases of interstate illegal gambling the United States Attorney's Office in Los Angeles had processed in over a decade. Ray Morrow had quietly transferred to a different division, citing personal reasons. The transfer had been approved without pushback, which told me that the people who had previously managed his silence had decided he was more useful at a distance than under continued supervision. And Linda Cho's 11 seconds of footage sat in certified forensic preservation on a server maintained by Frank's law firm, untouched and waiting alongside the cloud backup from San Jose and Greg's parallel ledgers, and Ray's 23 pages of handwritten notes and the time-stamped record of every ruling Harold Penn had made during my trial. I had 30 days left on my sentence when Peter Wald arrived on a Tuesday morning in February and set his notepad on the table without sitting down. That had never happened before. "Frank called this morning," Peter said. His voice was different, not louder, not faster, but compressed the way a voice gets when the person speaking it is managing something urgent with deliberate care. "He needs you to hear this today." My chest tightened. "Sit down, Peter." He sat. He opened his notepad. And he told me. Nathan had applied for a second passport through a citizenship by investment program offered by a small island nation in the Eastern Caribbean. The program was legal, widely used by high net worth individuals seeking travel flexibility, and entirely unremarkable in isolation. What made it remarkable was the timing. The application had been filed 11 weeks ago. Processing time for the program averaged between 8 and 12 weeks, which meant the passport was either already in Nathan's possession or would be within the next 2 weeks. The nation in question maintained no extradition treaty with the United States. Frank had verified this through 3 independent sources. Nathan was also moving money, not in the incremental operational flows Frank had been documenting for nearly 3 years. This was a different kind of movement, larger transfers, fewer intermediary steps, the kind of financial behavior that looked to someone who had spent 30 years watching people prepare to disappear, exactly like someone preparing to disappear. Frank estimated that, at the current pace of transfers, Nathan would have liquidated his accessible domestic assets within 60 days. I had 30 days left on my sentence. I sat with the arithmetic of that for exactly 10 seconds. Then I said, "What does Frank need?" Peter turned a page in his notepad. "He needs a plan for the first 72 hours after your release, specific, sequenced, and executable without any visible connection to you until the final step." The room was very quiet. I could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling, the distant sounds of the facility beyond the consultation room door. I pressed both hands flat against the table and looked at the wall across from me, the same painted concrete I had pressed my palms against twice in the preceding months, when the information in this room became too large to absorb while remaining still. This time I did not need to stand. The thing moving through me was not shock or grief or rage. It was something colder and more functional than any of those. It was the particular clarity that comes from 3 years of preparation, meeting a deadline that has finally become real. "On 24 hours, I said. As soon as I clear the gate, Frank files the TRO application with the Federal District Court. The motion includes the second passport application as primary evidence of flight risk that satisfies the irreparable harm standard under Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 65 RB. And gives the court sufficient basis to approve the restraining order on an emergency ex parte basis without notifying Nathan in advance." I paused. "The TRO freezes every domestic asset tied to Nathan, Sophia, and all 23 Delaware companies. Every account, every property, every instrument. Frozen before he knows we have moved." Peter was writing rapidly. "And the criminal side, 48 hours, I said. Frank takes the complete evidentiary package to the United States Attorney's Office directly. Not through channels, not through an intermediary, directly to the senior assistant I worked with for 11 years before I retired. She will recognize the quality of what Frank has built, and she will move on it." I stopped, breathed once. "Arrest warrants for Nathan and Sophia on the federal counts. A separate warrant for Penn under California Penal Code Section 92, coordinated with the State Attorney General's office." Peter looked up from his notepad. "And the 72-hour mark?" I looked at him steadily. "Nathan will not be able to resist it," I said. "He has been building toward the specific kind of moment, the kind that announces arrival, that puts his name and his supposed success in front of the right people. Frank has been watching his calendar. There is an event scheduled for the 3rd Friday of March, a signing dinner. Downtown hotel, invited partners from 3 cities. I paused. "He will not cancel it. A man who believes he has won does not cancel the celebration." Peter set his pen down briefly. "You've been planning the 72-hour window for a while." "Since month 10, I said. "When Greg gave us Penn, that was the moment I knew how it ended. I just did not know the date yet." I looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Now, I know the date." Peter picked his pen back up. He wrote for another minute, filling the bottom of the page with the precise shorthand he had developed over 3 years of these sessions. Then he looked up. "Frank asked me to ask you one more thing," he said. "Carol, does she get any warning?" The question settled in the room with a particular weight. I thought about Carol standing in the hallway with the phone already pressed against her ear. I thought about her hands tightening on the witness stand. I thought about what Nathan had used to put her there, and about the 3 letters between 2 people who had known each other in a different life, and about the way her chin had dropped a fraction of an inch in the 2 seconds she had finally looked at me in that courtroom. "No," I said. My voice was quiet, but it did not waver. She finds out when everyone else does, not before. Peter nodded. He did not write it down. Some answers did not need to be recorded. Marcus was on the bench outside the consultation room when I came through the door. He looked up at my face and straightened immediately the way a person straightens when they read something in another person's expression that requires a different kind of attention. "How long?" he asked. 30 days, I said. Marcus exhaled through his nose, slow and long. His hands pressed against his knees. He stared at the floor of the corridor for a moment, then looked back up at me, and in his face I saw something that I recognized because I had felt it myself. At various points over the preceding 3 years, the combination of relief and something almost like fear that comes from understanding that the thing you have been building toward is no longer abstract. "Are you ready?" he asked. I looked down the corridor, the long gray fluorescent-lit corridor I had walked every day for 35 months. I thought about 30 days more of it. I thought about what came after. "I have been ready," I said, "since the night they put the handcuffs on me." The gate opened at 6:41 in the morning, not the heavy internal gates I had passed through every day for 36 months. Those had opened and closed behind me so many times that I had stopped hearing them. This was the final gate. The outer perimeter gate of California State Prison at Chino, set in a chain-link fence topped with razor wire that caught the early light and threw it back in sharp, cold fragments. I walked through it carrying a canvas bag that weighed less than 8 pounds. The sky above the San Bernardino Valley was the particular pale blue of a California March morning, before the heat arrived, clear and very still. The kind of sky that exists in the hour before the world decides what kind of day it is going to be. The San Gabriel Mountains were visible to the northwest, darker than the sky behind them, and I stood on the concrete apron outside the gate for a moment and looked at them. They looked different from this side of the fence, larger, more specific. Frank was parked 40 yards away, in a black sedan engine running. He got out when he saw me come through the gate and walked toward me across the lot. We had not seen each other in person in 36 months. He was grayer than I remembered, and he moved with a slight stiffness in his right knee that had not been there before. I assumed, similarly changed in ways I could not fully assess from the inside. We met in the middle of the parking lot. He looked at my face for a long moment. Then he put his hand on my shoulder once briefly with a firmness that said everything that did not need to be said, and then he dropped it. "We have 72 hours, he said. "I know," I said. "Let's go." He drove. I sat in the passenger seat and watched the landscape change as we moved west, the flat industrial sprawl of the Inland Empire, giving way gradually to the denser residential grids of the San Gabriel Valley, then the familiar contours of Pasadena appearing on the horizon. We did not drive to Marengo Avenue. We did not drive past the house on the street where I had lived for 22 years. Frank drove directly to the law offices of a 3-partner firm in Arcadia that had been preparing for this morning for 4 months. In the men's room off the main hallway, I changed. I had asked Frank to bring a specific suit, the dark charcoal one I had worn to my retirement ceremony 6 years ago, which he had retrieved from a storage unit where I had placed several boxes of personal effects before my conviction. It fit differently than it had 6 years ago. My shoulders were the same, but there was something about the way it settled on me that was not about the fabric or the cut. I stood in front of the mirror above the sink and looked at the man looking back at me. 65 years old, 36 months older than the last time I had worn this suit. Gray at the temples that had not been gray before, lines in my face that were deeper and more settled, but the eyes were the same, exactly the same, and they were looking at me with an expression I recognized from 30 years of standing in front of mirrors before major trials. Calm, focused, entirely prepared for what came next. I straightened my collar. I picked up the canvas bag and left it on the counter. I would not be needing it anymore. 24 hours after I walked through the gate at Chino, Frank filed the TRO application with the Federal District Court. The motion was 47 pages. It included a certified copy of Nathan's citizenship by investment application as primary evidence of flight risk. A man actively seeking a second passport in a nation with no extradition agreement with the United States, while simultaneously liquidating domestic assets at an accelerating rate, met the irreparable harm standard under Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 65 B of As in a way that left the court very little room for interpretation. Frank filed at 2 in the afternoon. The duty judge reviewed the motion at 4:30. By 8 in the evening, the order was signed. Every domestic asset tied to Nathan Briggs, Sophia Briggs, and all 23 Delaware corporate entities was frozen. Every bank account, every property, every financial instrument, every pending transaction suspended mid-execution. The accounts Nathan had been preparing to drain for his disappearance went still locked from the outside by a court order he did not yet know existed. I was sitting in a conference room in Arcadia when Frank got the call confirming the order had been signed. He set his phone down on the table and looked at me across the stack of documents we had been reviewing for the preceding 6 hours. "Done," he said. I nodded. "Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. Frank and I arrived at the United States Attorney's Office in downtown Los Angeles at 7:58 on the morning of March 16th. The receptionist called back to the office of the senior assistant I had worked alongside for 11 years, and 90 seconds later, she came through the door herself. A sharp, compact woman in her early 50s named Patricia Hale, who had the specific energy of someone who had been briefed on what was coming and had spent the preceding night preparing for it. She shook my hand and looked at Frank's document case and said, "How long did it take you to build this?" 3 years, Frank said. She nodded once the way someone nods when an answer confirms what they already knew. "Come in." We spent 4 hours in her conference room. Frank walked her team through the evidentiary package, the cloud footage, Greg's parallel ledgers, the financial records documenting Penn's payments, Ray Morrow's photographs and notes, Linda Cho's 11 seconds of video. Each item was cataloged, cross-referenced, and received into the office's formal record under the cooperation agreement Greg had signed 14 months earlier. Patricia Hale asked exactly 9 questions during the 4 hours. Each one was precise and went directly to the most defensible point in the corresponding piece of evidence. By the time we reached the final document, she had already pulled up Nathan's criminal exposure on the screen behind her federal counts that stacked into decades if prosecuted individually, and ran concurrently into something that would end his operational freedom for a very long time. She signed the warrant request at 12:47 in the afternoon and submitted it immediately to the duty magistrate judge, who approved and issued the arrest warrants before the close of business. Penn's state warrant went to the Attorney General's office, simultaneously coordinated through a contact Patricia had maintained for 6 years. We walked out into the Los Angeles noon light, and Frank stopped on the sidewalk and turned to look at me. "One more night," he said. "One more night." I agreed. In the hotel room Frank had booked for me, 2 blocks from the office, I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my phone for the first time in 36 months. There was a message from Marcus sent the morning I was released, time-stamped 6:43, 2 minutes after the gate opened. It said only, "Go get them." I typed back 2 words and set the phone down. Then I opened the document Frank had left on the nightstand, the final piece of the preparation, the one I had been thinking about since month 10 of my sentence. The event details for Nathan's signing dinner. The Waldorf Astoria, downtown Los Angeles, Friday evening, 7 o'clock, tomorrow. I set the document down and looked at the ceiling of the hotel room for a long time. 36 months had felt on the morning they began like an enormous and uncrossable distance. Standing on the other side of them, I understood that they had not been a punishment. They had been a preparation. Nathan had given me 36 months in a place where I had nothing to do but think and document and build and wait. I had come to understand the worst mistake he had ever made. The Waldorf Astoria, in downtown Los Angeles, occupies the upper floors of a tower that rises 45 stories above Figueroa Street, and on the evening of March the 17th, the private dining room on the 32nd floor had been reserved entirely for Nathan Briggs. He had spared nothing. The room held 22 people, partners from New York, Chicago, and Miami, 3 corporate attorneys, 2 financial consultants, and a handful of the kind of well-dressed adjacencies that successful men accumulate for evenings like this one. The table was set with the specific excess of someone who has been waiting a long time to demonstrate that he has arrived. Crystal glasses, heavy silverware, a floral arrangement in the center that had cost more than most people's monthly rent. Nathan stood near the window at the far end of the room, holding a glass of bourbon and looking out at the Los Angeles skyline with the easy proprietorial satisfaction of a man surveying something he believed belonged to him. He was wearing a charcoal suit, dark tie. He looked from a distance remarkably like his father. Sophia stood 3 feet to his left in a crimson evening dress that caught the light every time she moved. She was working the room with the practiced fluency of someone who had spent years learning to make other people feel noticed, touching arms, laughing at the right moments, keeping her glass raised in a way that suggested celebration without tipping into excess. She was extraordinary at it. She had always been extraordinary at it. Neither of them had any idea that every bank account they owned had been frozen for 48 hours. The conversation in the room had the particular quality of people who believe they are in the presence of money that is going somewhere, animated forward, leaning full of the kind of laughter that comes from being confident about what comes next. The partners from New York were talking about expansion timelines. The attorneys were reviewing final contract language. Someone near the window was describing a property in the Cayman Islands with genuine enthusiasm. At 7:45, Nathan moved to the head of the table. The room quieted. Glasses were raised. Nathan set his bourbon down and picked up the pen the attorney had placed on the leather folder in front of him, the signing copies of the partnership agreements that would formalize the expansion of his network into 3 new markets. He looked around the table at the assembled faces and smiled the smile of a man who has rehearsed this moment many times in his own imagination. "Gentlemen," he said, "and ladies, 3 years ago, I started building something that people told me was too ambitious." He paused for effect. His voice carried the easy confidence of someone who believes that what he is saying is true. "Tonight we make it permanent." He looked down at the signature line. He uncapped the pen. In the hallway outside the dining room, Frank Delano stood beside a man named Special Agent Dennis Cho of the FBI's Los Angeles field office. Behind them, in 2 groups arranged on either side of the corridor, were 8 additional agents in dark suits. Frank had his hands in his jacket pockets. He was watching the second hand on his watch move through its final rotation. The dining room door was 12 feet away. Frank looked at Dennis and gave a single nod. Dennis put his hand on the door. Inside the dining room, Nathan's pen touched the paper. The door opened. "Before I tell you what happened when that door opened, before I show you the moment 36 months of silence finally spoke out loud, type Walter in the comments. Let me know you have been here for every step of this. Because what comes next is the moment I had been building toward since the night they put the handcuffs on me." And remember, this story carries fictional elements crafted for education and reflection. If you would rather step away before the ending, this is your moment, no judgment and no hard feelings. I walked into that room the way I had walked into every courtroom for 30 years, shoulders back, head level, eyes forward. The kind of walk that does not ask permission and does not announce itself. It simply occupies the space it moves through with a completeness that makes it difficult to look anywhere else. The room registered my presence before anyone in it had fully processed what they were seeing. The conversation died in uneven stages, the way sound drops out across a room when something unexpected enters it. Table by table, cluster by cluster, until the only noise remaining was the soft clink of a glass being set down too quickly near the window. Nathan looked up from the signature line. The pen was still in his hand. His mouth was open slightly, not in speech, not in preparation for speech, but in the suspended, unfinished way of a man whose next action has been interrupted before his body understood it was being interrupted. The color left his face in a single visible withdrawal, as though something beneath the skin had simply switched off. I walked to the head of the table. I set the document case down on the mahogany surface, the same case Frank had carried out of Chino 3 days ago. And I looked at my son across the length of the table and said, 36 months ago, you were very confident." Nathan's pen dropped from his fingers. It rolled 2 inches across the leather folder and stopped. I opened the case. The first document I placed on the table was the certified forensic copy of the cloud footage from the night of March 14, 2022. The original file showing Sophia entering my house alone at 6:47 in the evening, 12 minutes before I opened my study door. I turned it to face the room. She walked into my house, alone. I said to no one in particular and to everyone. 12 minutes before I came out of my study. The original file was deleted from the local hard drive. The backup on the manufacturer's server in San Jose was not. I placed the second document beside the first. Greg's parallel ledgers, certified copies, the real numbers beneath the sanitized ones. $30 million annually moving through 23 Delaware shells in violation of 18 United States Code. Section 1955, the federal statute governing large-scale illegal gambling operations. A man near the window stood up. He looked at Nathan. Nathan did not look back at him. The third document was the financial record showing the quarterly payments routed through a Nevada holding account, to the Penn Family Administrative Trust, Harold Penn, sitting judge personal payroll of Nathan Briggs, for 14 months before and during my trial in violation of California Penal Code. Section 92. One of the corporate attorneys pushed back from the table. The fourth document was Ray Morrow's typed summary and crime scene photographs. The fifth was Linda Cho's 11-second video, cued on a tablet Frank had handed me at the door. I set the tablet face up on the table and pressed play. The room watched 11 seconds of Sophia walking up my driveway entirely alone in the rain-wet dusk of a Friday evening in March. The partners from New York were on their feet. Someone was already on a phone voice, low and urgent, and moving toward the door. I looked at Nathan. He had not moved. He was still standing at the head of the table with both hands now braced against the mahogany surface, his weight forward, his face the color of old concrete. His chest was rising and falling with the short, effortful breathing of a man whose body has understood something his mind is still refusing. "You gave me 36 months, I said. My voice was very quiet. The room was so still that quiet carried the same distance as a shout. You put me in a concrete room and you took everything you thought mattered, the house, the years, the name." I paused. "You forgot one thing." He said nothing. His hands were trembling against the table, a fine involuntary tremor that he was not able to stop. "You forgot that I spent 30 years learning how people like you build things," I said, "and how they fall." The dining room door opened behind me. Special Agent Dennis Cho came through first credentials, already raised voice clear and carrying through the stunned silence of the room. Behind him, in 2 precise columns, came 8 agents in dark suits who moved through the space with the particular efficiency of people who have rehearsed exactly this. "Nathan Briggs." Dennis's voice was flat and entirely without drama. "You are under arrest." Nathan straightened. His hands came up from the table, not in surrender, but in the involuntary upward movement of a man whose body is reacting faster than his decisions. An agent stepped to his left side. The handcuffs came out. The sound they made when they closed was very small in that room. Sophia made a sound I had not expected, not a scream, not the practiced theatrical cry I had heard on the staircase 3 years ago. It was something smaller and more honest than that. A short, broken exhalation that came from somewhere below her performance, below the crimson dress and the rehearsed laugh, and the 11 years of calculated presentation. She backed against the window, both hands pressed flat to the glass behind her, and 2 agents moved toward her with a calm and unhurried authority that left her no direction to go. As they guided her toward the door, she turned her head. She looked at me. I had expected many things in that moment: defiance, anger, another performance. What I had not expected was what I actually saw: a face that had dropped every layer it had ever constructed, leaving something underneath that was simply exhausted and frightened, and in some way I could not fully articulate, relieved. The relief of someone who has been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time and has finally been permitted to set it down, even if the setting down comes with consequences she had not chosen. I looked at her for 2 full seconds. Then I gave her the only thing I had available to give in that moment. I let her see that I had noticed. Not forgiven, not forgotten, but noticed. She looked away. The agents guided her through the door. Dennis crossed to me when the room had largely cleared. "Penn was taken at his residence in Hancock Park 40 minutes ago," he said quietly. "No resistance." I nodded. The room was nearly empty now. The partners gone, the attorneys gone, the optimistic conversation about Cayman Islands properties dispersed into the Los Angeles night. The floral arrangement sat at the center of the long table, entirely undisturbed. The crystal glasses caught the light. Nathan's pen lay on the leather folder where it had rolled and stopped. The signature line beneath it was blank. My phone vibrated in my jacket pocket. I did not need to look at the screen to know who it was. I stepped out of the elevator into the hotel corridor and answered the phone on the 4th ring. I had stood in the lobby for a moment after leaving the 32nd floor, watching the city through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the Waldorf's lower atrium. The lights of downtown Los Angeles spreading outward in every direction, indifferent and enormous and entirely unaware of what had just occurred in a private dining room 40 stories above the street. I had needed that moment. Not to compose myself. I was composed. I had needed it to locate somewhere in the territory of what I was feeling, the particular register in which I was going to have this conversation. There was no good register for it. I answered anyway. "Walter?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. It carried the specific texture of a voice that has been crying for a long time and has arrived at the place beyond crying where the throat is raw and the words come out stripped of everything except their essential meaning. "Carol," I said. She did not speak for a moment. I heard her breathing uneven, effortful, the breathing of someone trying very hard to hold themselves upright through a conversation they have been dreading and cannot avoid. "I watched it on the news," she said finally. "They showed the hotel. They showed Nathan being—" She stopped. The stop had a fracture in it, a place where the sentence had broken under its own weight before she could finish it. "I didn't know, Walter. I need you to know that I did not know what he had built. I knew he was doing things he shouldn't have been doing, but I did not know the scope of it. I did not know about the people he hurt. I did not know about—" Her voice broke entirely on the last word and did not reassemble itself. I stood in the corridor with the phone against my ear and listened to my wife of 40 years come apart on the other end of the line. The fluorescent lights of the hotel hallway hummed above me. Somewhere down the corridor a door opened and closed. "I know," I said. 2 words. She had been waiting. I understood for those 2 words or their opposite, for confirmation or condemnation, for the verdict that only I could deliver. I gave her the truth because the truth was what I had spent 36 months in pursuit of, and I was not going to stop now. "I know you didn't choose it," I said. "I know what he used. Frank told me. I have known since month 7. I paused. The pause had a specific weight to it, the weight of everything I had thought about this in the intervening months, all the conversations I had rehearsed in my cell at Chino, and then set aside, because they were not the conversation I was going to have. They were the conversation I wanted to have, which was not the same thing. What Nathan did to you was a crime. You were coerced. The federal investigators understand that, and you will be treated accordingly." Carol exhaled a long, shuddering sound that was not quite relief and not quite grief, but something that lived in the narrow space between them. "That's not why I called," she said. "I know," I said again. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something very small and very direct. "Are you all right?" The question hit me somewhere I had not expected, not in the chest where most of the impact of the preceding 3 years had landed. Somewhere older and quieter than that. The place where a person keeps the version of themselves that existed before everything that happened to them happened. "I'm going to be," I said, and I meant it, which surprised me slightly. Carol made a sound that was not a word. It carried in its 2 syllables of breath and broken air 40 years of a particular kind, of knowing the kind that accumulates between 2 people who have lived alongside each other long enough to understand each other's silences and their meanings. We had not lost that whatever else we had lost. It was still there, intact and useless, like a key to a house that no longer exists. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know that's not—" She stopped. "I know there's nothing that—" She stopped again. The sentence had nowhere to go that was adequate to where she needed it to arrive, and she understood that, and so she let it rest unfinished. "I know," I said for the 3rd time. I stayed on the line for another minute. Neither of us said anything further that required saying. When I ended the call, I stood in the corridor for a moment with the phone in my hand and looked at nothing in particular. A patch of wall, a numbered door, a light fixture that needed replacing. 3 days later, my attorney delivered an envelope to the house on Marengo, the house that was no longer mine in the neighborhood where Linda Cho watered her plants every Friday evening. And Ray Morrow had once driven home, not knowing that the question forming in his mind would take 18 months to answer. Inside the envelope was a single document. 32 pages, standard California dissolution of marriage form, already signed on every line that required my signature. Carol's attorney had told Frank in the brief professional exchange that accompanied the delivery that Carol had read it the same afternoon it arrived, that she had not called anyone, that she had signed her own name on the corresponding lines that same evening at the kitchen table and returned it the following morning. Frank told me this when he met me for coffee in Arcadia the day after the delivery. He set his cup down and said carefully, "She asked me one thing when I called to confirm receipt." I looked at him across the table. "She asked if you were sleeping," Frank said. I looked at the table for a moment. Then I looked back up at him. "What did you tell her?" "I told her yes," he said, "because it's true." He picked up his coffee. I picked up mine. Outside the window of the Arcadia coffee shop, The San Gabriel Valley went about its ordinary morning business traffic and school runs, and the specific unremarkable industry of a Tuesday in Southern California, indifferent to the fact that everything in the lives of the two men at the corner table had changed irrevocably in the preceding 72 hours. "She'll be all right?" Frank said, not as a question. "Yes," I said. "She will." I believe that. Carol was 61 years old, and she had been carrying a weight that was not hers to carry, and now it was gone, and the consequences of its removal were significant and real, but they were not unsurvivable. She was not a woman who did not survive things. I had known that about her for 40 years. It was one of the things I had most admired about her, and admiring it did not require me to stay. We finished our coffee. Frank paid the check. We walked out into the San Gabriel morning, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and felt the March air on my face cool and carrying the faint smell of orange blossom from somewhere, a street or two over the particular scent of a California spring that means nothing and means everything depending on where you are standing when you encounter it. "What's next?" Frank asked. I thought about the motion my attorneys had already filed, the certified evidence package already in the hands of the court, the date 6 months away when I would stand in a different courtroom and speak the truth to a judge who had not been paid to disbelieve me. "We wait one more time," I said, "and then we finish it." The courtroom was smaller than I remembered. Not the same courtroom. I had not been back to courtroom 14 since the morning Harold Penn brought his gavel down and ended one version of my life. This was a different room on a different floor of a different building in downtown Los Angeles, and it belonged to the California Court of Appeal, Second Appellate District. The ceiling was lower, the wood was lighter, the windows looked north instead of east, and through them, on the morning of October 9th, 2025, I could see a pale blue sky that looked almost exactly like the sky above the San Bernardino Valley on the morning I had walked out of Chino. I was not sitting at the defendant's table this time. I was sitting behind the bar, in the first row of the gallery, in a good suit, beside Frank Delano, watching my attorneys present the motion to vacate my conviction under California Penal Code Section 1473. The motion was based on 2 grounds: newly discovered evidence that had not been available at the time of trial and judicial misconduct by the presiding judge Harold Penn, whose acceptance of payments from Nathan Briggs had been thoroughly documented, formally charged, and was already proceeding through a separate criminal proceeding in the state court system. The hearing took 4 hours. The appellate panel asked 21 questions. My lead attorney answered each one with the particular steady confidence of someone who has the evidence and knows it and does not need to perform certainty because certainty is simply the accurate description of the situation. The opposing counsel appointed to represent the state's interest in the original conviction raised 3 objections. All 3 were disposed of before lunch. At 2:17 in the afternoon, the presiding judge of the panel looked up from the bench and said in the measured, unhurried language of someone announcing a conclusion that has been carefully arrived at, that the motion was granted. The conviction was vacated. The record was to be expunged. Walter Briggs had no criminal history. I sat very still when she said it. Frank put his hand on my arm, the same brief, firm gesture he had used in the parking lot at Chino 7 months earlier. I covered his hand with mine for a moment. Then we both looked back at the front of the room where my attorneys were shaking hands with the court clerk and gathering their papers with the efficient, unhurried movements of people at the end of a long and successful day's work. The trial of Nathan Briggs. Sophia Briggs and their network of associates had been ongoing since the summer and had concluded just weeks before this hearing, after 11 days of testimony and 4 days of jury deliberation. Nathan had been convicted on 7 federal counts, including operating an illegal gambling business under 18 United States Code. Section 1955, money laundering, under 18 United States Code. Section 1956, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The sentences were substantial. Nathan would not be operating anything for a very long time. Sophia had entered a guilty plea to 3 counts in the weeks before trial, accepting a negotiated sentence that, her attorneys had argued, reflected the coercive circumstances of her involvement. I had not contested the negotiated plea. What I had said when my own attorneys asked me whether I wished to submit a victim impact statement addressing Sophia's sentencing was this. I had seen her face when the agents guided her through the dining room door. I did not need to say anything more. Harold Penn had been convicted in state court of bribery of a judicial officer under California Penal Code Section 92. He was no longer a judge. He would not be one again. 3 weeks after the appellate ruling, I received a text message from a number I did not recognize. It said, "They told me today. Thank you. I mean it." I sat with the message for a moment before I understood. Then I replied with Marcus Webb's name as a question, and the response came back immediately, a single word confirming. My attorneys had filed the motion for Marcus 8 months earlier, after Frank identified the critical discrepancy in the chain of custody documentation that had been used to implicate him. The appellate court had ruled in his favor 6 weeks ago. I had paid the legal fees without being asked and without mentioning it because Marcus had given me something in the library at Chino that could not be valued in any currency I was aware of. He had looked at me on my 3rd week and told me I did not look like someone who had done what they said I did. And in that particular moment, those particular words had been the difference between a man who continues and a man who stops. I moved into the apartment on the 3rd of November. It was on the 4th floor of a building, 3 blocks from the Santa Monica waterfront, with a small balcony that faced west and caught the afternoon light in a way that made the interior of the living room glow for approximately 40 minutes each day around 4 o'clock. I owned almost nothing: a bed, a desk, a chair, the boxes Frank had retrieved from storage. I did not want more than that yet. I had spent 36 months in a space where everything was provided and nothing was chosen, and there was something clarifying about beginning again with almost nothing and selecting each addition deliberately. On the first morning, I woke before the sun. I made coffee in the kitchen, a process that took slightly longer than it should have, because I was still relearning the specific rhythms of a kitchen that was entirely my own, and I carried the cup out to the balcony and sat in the single chair I had positioned there the evening before and watched the sky above the Pacific change. It began as the deep uniform gray of the hour before dawn, the color of something that has not yet decided what it is. Then the gray thinned and separated at the horizon, and below it, where the ocean met the edge of the visible world, a line of pale gold appeared and held and gradually widened. Then the color moved upward and changed as it moved gold into amber, into a soft, clear rose that spread across the lower sky and reflected itself in the surface of the water below, so that for a few minutes the ocean and the sky were the same color, and it was impossible to tell exactly where one ended and the other began. I had not seen a sunrise in 36 months. Not a real one, unobstructed, unframed by fencing or wire or reinforced glass. Just the open sky above open water, going through its ordinary morning transformation, with the complete indifference of something that has been doing this for 4.5 billion years, and will continue doing it long after every courthouse and prison and glass-walled conference room has been returned to dust. It was, I thought, the most ordinary thing I had ever seen. It was also the most beautiful. Frank knocked on the door at 8 o'clock with 2 cups of coffee from the place on the corner that he had identified during his reconnaissance of the neighborhood the week before. I moved in because Frank Delano had spent 22 years working for me and had never once waited to be asked to do a useful thing. I let him in. We carried our cups to the balcony and sat, Frank in the chair, me leaning against the railing, and looked out at the water, which had settled from its morning colors into the flat, mild blue of a California November morning. And neither of us said anything for a while, because there was nothing that needed to be said that had not already been said or done or documented in triplicate and filed with the appropriate authorities. After a while, Frank said, "What are you going to do?" I thought about it genuinely because it was a genuine question, and he deserved a genuine answer. "Right," I said. Frank raised an eyebrow. "About the cases, no," I said. "About this one." He looked at me for a moment, then he nodded slowly, the nod of a man who understands something without needing it, explained. He drank his coffee, I drank mine. Below the balcony, the Pacific went about its work, patient and enormous and entirely uninterested in the affairs of the 2 men watching it from the 4th floor. I thought about Nathan. I thought about Sophia. I thought about Carol at a kitchen table on a Tuesday evening, signing her name on 32 pages and not calling anyone. I thought about Ray Morrow not sleeping for 18 months. I thought about Linda Cho keeping a cracked phone in a drawer because she could not bring herself to throw away the only thing she had that told the truth. I thought about Greg Paulson sitting in a parking lot in Monrovia with a cold cup of coffee and 10 months of accumulated fear waiting for someone to knock on his window. I thought about what I had learned, which was not what I had expected to learn. I had expected going in that 36 months would teach me something about endurance or patience or the institutional failures of a legal system that can be bent by money and personal grudge. And it had taught me those things. But the thing it had taught me most deeply was something smaller and more specific than any of those. It had taught me that the truth does not disappear when it is inconvenient. It waits. It waits in cloud servers and fireproof safes and kitchen drawers and the handwritten notes of a cop who cannot sleep. And it waits with the particular patience of something that does not need to be in a hurry, because it is not going anywhere. The people who build their comfort on the suppression of it always make the same mistake. They assume that buried means gone. It does not. Buried means waiting. I had spent 36 months waiting alongside it. And in the end, the truth had done what the truth always does if you give it enough time and enough people who are not willing to look the other way. It had simply come up. I set my coffee cup on the railing and looked out at the Pacific for a long time. The November light was clean and flat and came from everywhere, at once the way light does on the California coast in the weeks before winter. And it made everything it touched look very clear and very specific and very much exactly what it was. Frank finished his coffee. He set the cup down. "You know," he said, "for the record, I never doubted it." I looked at him. "Not once," he said. "Not for a single day." I looked back at the water. "I know," I said. "That's why I called you. There is one thing 36 months in a concrete cell taught me that no courtroom ever could. The truth does not need your help. It does not need your anger or your urgency or your desperation. It only needs one thing: someone willing to wait long enough to let it surface on its own. I was that person. And if this family story has given you anything tonight, I hope it is this family. Betrayal does not destroy you unless you let it define you. I chose to let it build me instead. Every document Frank filed, every witness who chose courage over silence, every morning, I woke up in that cell and wrote one more line in that legal pad that was my answer to what my family chose to do to me. I believe God does not place you in the valley to break you. He places you there to show you what you are made of when everything comfortable has been taken away. Do not be like the people in this family story who mistook silence for surrender. And do not be like the man I was before March 14th, 2022. The man who trusted too easily and watched too little. Family betrayal begins quietly. So does justice. If this story moved, you drop a comment, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Every story on this channel exists because you are here. Thank you for staying until the very end. The characters and events in this story contain fictional elements created for reflection and education. If this content is not right for you, step away freely and take good care of yourself.